The legal and historical bedrock of American farmland, the 1930s USDA Conservation Movement. The conflict at the heart of this narrative, a desperate corporate attempt to seize family farmland via eminent domain, countered and ultimately defeated by a seemingly ancient United States Department of Agriculture, USDA, document, is far more than a simple property dispute. It is a powerful allegory for the enduring struggle between ephemeral economic development and perpetual land stewardship. The legal instrument that saved the farm, the 1933 USDA Conservation Easement, is not merely a technicality. It is a foundational artifact of American agricultural policy, born from catastrophe and designed to protect the nation's most vital resource, its soil. This section explores the historical forces that necessitated such profound legal commitments, the mechanics of the early USDA conservation programs, and the critical legal superiority that transforms a 70-year-old bureaucratic paper into a nuclear weapon against modern predatory development. The genesis of stewardship, America's agricultural crisis of the 1930s. To understand the immense power vested in a 1933 USDA document, one must first appreciate the apocalyptic conditions under which it was conceived. The early 20th century saw American agriculture defined by rapid expansion and often destructive practices. Driven by wartime demand and technological optimism, farmers tilled millions of acres of marginal land, especially across the Great Plains, removing the native prairie grasses whose roots had held the soil for millennia. The inevitable consequence of this overtilling, combined with severe drought, culminated in the infamous Dust Bowl. Between 1930 and 1936, massive dust storms, known as black blizzards, ravaged the central United States, literally lifting the topsoil off farms and carrying it hundreds of miles. These storms choked cities, buried equipment, and rendered millions of acres worthless for farming. The crisis was not just economic. It was an existential threat to the nation's food supply and the health of its citizens. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration recognized this as a crisis demanding radical federal intervention. It was clear that individual farmers, already crippled by the Great Depression, could not solve a problem of this ecological and geographic scale on their own. This recognition led directly to the formation of foundational New Deal programs, which dramatically reshaped the USDA's role from a statistical and promotional agency into an active manager of the nation's natural capital. Key legislative actions established the legal framework for the easement that saved the protagonist's farm. The Soil Erosion Act, 1935. This act created the Soil Conservation Service, SCS, later renamed the Natural Resources Conservation Service, or NRCS. Its mission was simple but revolutionary: to provide permanently for the control and prevention of soil erosion. The SCS was mandated to work directly with landowners, providing technical assistance, education, and financial incentives to implement conservation practices like contour plowing, strip cropping, and terracing. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, AAA, while primarily focused on controlling supply and prices, the AAA also introduced the concept of payments for conservation. Farmers were compensated not for producing certain crops, but for taking land out of production and implementing soil-saving practices. This fundamentally shifted the government's relationship with private property, establishing the principle that the health of the land was a matter of national security, deserving of federal investment and protection. The 1933 easement, therefore, is rooted in the most desperate moment of American agricultural history, making its provisions functionally untouchable because they serve a purpose deemed essential to the long-term survival of the nation. The conservation easement, a perpetual legal shield. The protagonist's victory hinges entirely on the legal mechanism of the conservation easement established under these New Deal programs. Unlike standard zoning laws or deed restrictions, which can be easily modified or challenged at the county level, a federal conservation easement possesses a unique and formidable legal standing. Defining the easement. A conservation easement is a voluntary, legally binding agreement that permanently limits certain types of development or land use to protect the property's conservation values. In the context of the 1930s USDA initiatives, the purpose was explicitly defined as maintaining the land for sustainable agriculture, soil integrity, and watershed protection. Crucially, the easement is an interest in real property that is conveyed, in part, to a third party, in this case, the federal government, through the USDA or its designated service. This interest is recorded on the property deed and, most importantly, runs with the land in perpetuity. This means the obligations and restrictions remain binding on all future owners, regardless of who buys the land or what local laws may change. The superiority of federal commitment. The developer, Mr. Sterling, was confident in using eminent domain because he likely believed the farm's conservation status was a minor, local restrictive covenant. Restrictive covenants are private agreements typically enforceable by a homeowners association, like the antagonistic HOA in the original script style, or by other property owners. They are often subject to expiration, modification, or judicial review based on changing neighborhood conditions. The federal USDA easement is fundamentally different. Federal jurisdiction. It places the land under the jurisdiction of a federal agreement. This immediately elevates the dispute from a local zoning argument to a matter of federal policy enforcement. Permanent purpose. The purpose is not aesthetic or local. It is a permanent commitment to the national interest in soil conservation and food security. No expiration. The term in perpetuity is not symbolic. It is a legal directive. The USDA interest cannot be extinguished unless the federal agency itself agrees to abandon the conservation values, a process that is deliberately complex and rare, requiring extensive public review and justification. The fatal flaw in the developer's due diligence was ignoring this federal element. They calculated their risk based on county law, neglecting the paramount power of a document signed under the authority of the U.S. government during a period of national emergency. The easement acts as a super lien, legally encumbering the land with a permanent, non-negotiable purpose. It must remain farmland. Eminent domain versus federal supremacy. The developer's ultimate plan hinged on the power of eminent domain, the authority of the government to take private property for public use, provided just compensation is paid. While this power is vast and enshrined in the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution, it is not absolute, and it is especially vulnerable when it conflicts with a pre-existing federal mandate. The developer's miscalculation. Mr. Sterling's acquisition strategy was based on three faulty assumptions common in high-stakes development. Public use justification. He correctly anticipated that the county would delegate its eminent domain power for his project by classifying the luxury golf course as a public good, e.g., job creation, increased tax revenue, community amenity. Financial override. He assumed that a large enough monetary offer or compensation package could easily resolve any existing local land use restriction. Due diligence failure. His legal team focused narrowly on local zoning and recent deed transfers, failing to research the deep, historical federal filings that predate modern zoning codes. The 1933 date made the document invisible to standard 20-year title searches. The developer didn't just ignore a piece of paper. He failed to respect the supremacy clause of the U.S. Constitution, which establishes that federal laws and treaties are the supreme law of the land. The legal impossibility of the golf course. To successfully use eminent domain to seize the land, the developer, or the county acting on his behalf, would need to prove one of two things, both of which are practically impossible in this scenario. Higher public use. They would have to demonstrate that a luxury golf course serves a greater public purpose than the permanent national interest in food security and soil conservation protected by the USDA. In a legal showdown, especially given the history of the Dust Bowl, a federal judge is highly unlikely to agree that manicured greens supersede the integrity of essential farmland. Easement extinguishment. They would need the USDA itself, represented by the NRCS, to formally agree that the conservation values of the land are no longer relevant, allowing the easement to be terminated. The USDA has a strong mandate to defend these agreements, as any failure to do so would undermine the reliability of all federal conservation programs nationwide. When the protagonist presented the 1933 federal easement, the legal ground beneath the developer collapsed. The developer's attempt at a local takeover was instantly nullified by a superior federal interest. The project was not merely complicated, it became a non-starter. The land was already taken by a higher, permanent authority for a perpetual public use defined as sustainable agriculture. This federal mandate, born of a desperate need to save the soil, ensured that the farm's future would remain tied to the USDA's original vision, protecting it not just for one generation, but for all generations to come. This is the bedrock upon which the rest of the narrative, the defeat of the developer and the subsequent systemic cleanup, is built. Conclusion of Section 1. This analysis confirms that the resolution of the conflict is rooted firmly in the enduring power of American public policy forged during a time of national crisis. The 1933 USDA Conservation Easement is the ultimate legal defense, functioning as an unassailable declaration that this parcel of land belongs to a purpose far greater than temporary profit. It transforms the farmer from a simple landowner into a federal steward, legally bound and federally protected in his mission to preserve the soil. The developer's failure was a failure of due diligence, a monumental miscalculation of the legal weight carried by the historical commitment of the United States Department of Agriculture. The ripple effect of oversight, watershed protection, and the developer's ironic downfall. The dramatic defeat of Mr. Sterling's eminent domain attempt by the 1933 USDA Conservation Easement was not the end of his troubles. It was merely the beginning of his true downfall. As the narrative reveals, the very act of trying to seize the farmer's land, and his subsequent failure to secure it, triggered a chain reaction of legal and financial penalties directly linked to the broader environmental protections enshrined within the USDA's historical mandates. This section will delve into the critical role of watershed management in federal conservation, expose how the developer's short-sightedness backfired catastrophically, and examine the systemic implications of ignoring integrated environmental regulations. The unseen mandate: watershed protection in 1930s conservation. While the primary immediate concern during the Dust Bowl era was preventing soil erosion and ensuring agricultural productivity, the visionaries at the USDA recognized that land stewardship was an interconnected system. Soil health is intrinsically linked to water quality, and the stability of a farm is dependent on the health of the entire watershed, the area of land that drains all the streams and rainfall to a common outlet, such as a river, lake, or bay. The 1933 USDA Conservation Easement was not a standalone document narrowly focused on a single parcel of dirt. It was part of a holistic framework designed to protect the ecological integrity of agricultural landscapes. This often included clauses pertaining to runoff management, preventing excess water, laden with soil or agricultural chemicals, from leaving the property and polluting downstream water bodies. Riparian zone protection, safeguarding the vegetated areas along streams, rivers, or lakes that filter pollutants, stabilize banks, and provide critical habitat. Wetland preservation, recognizing the vital role of wetlands in flood control, water filtration, and biodiversity. Sustainable drainage practices, encouraging methods that allow water to slowly infiltrate the ground rather than rapidly flowing off, preventing both erosion and downstream flooding. These provisions were not merely suggestions. They were legally binding conditions within the easement, reflecting the understanding that a healthy farm cannot exist in an unhealthy environment. The devastation of the Dust Bowl had taught the hard lesson that environmental degradation on one farm could have catastrophic, widespread impacts across an entire region. Therefore, early USDA conservation programs aimed to create a resilient agricultural system through integrated land and water management. For Mr. Sterling, these seemingly archaic clauses represented a hidden minefield. His development model was predicated on maximizing buildable area, often at the expense of natural drainage patterns, vegetation removal, and aggressive landscaping, all practices that directly conflict with robust watershed protection. The developer's fatal flaw: ignoring the interconnectedness. Mr. Sterling's ambition and overconfidence led him to make a critical strategic error. He began extensive construction on adjacent parcels before finalizing the acquisition of the protagonist's farm. This action, while seemingly logical from a developer's perspective, to show progress and apply pressure, proved to be his undoing. His construction involved massive grading and earth moving, reshaping the natural contours of the land to create the desired golf course features, luxury home sites, and club facilities. Vegetation removal, clearing vast tracts of natural flora, including trees and undergrowth that naturally absorb rainfall and prevent erosion. Impervious surfaces, laying down large areas of concrete, asphalt, and building foundations, which prevent rainwater from soaking into the ground and instead direct it as rapid surface runoff. These activities, on their own land, seemed perfectly legal and within their rights. However, the protagonist's land, protected by the USDA easement, was strategically located within the same larger watershed. The easement's clauses on watershed management and runoff control were not just about the protagonist's property. They dictated conditions for downstream impact and regional ecological health. When the eminent domain attempt failed, Sterling's partially completed construction stood as a stark violation of these federal requirements. The very act of preparing the adjacent land for a golf course, without proper mitigation, now presented an immediate and tangible threat to the protected farm's soil integrity and the downstream water quality it was legally obligated to maintain. The price of hubris, analyzing the financial disaster and regulatory compliance costs for the developer. The defeat of Mr. Sterling in the county zoning board meeting was not merely a loss of a desirable piece of property. It was a devastating systemic failure that resulted in a financial catastrophe for Sterling Acquisitions. The 1933 USDA Conservation Easement, by first blocking eminent domain and then exposing the adjacent construction's watershed violations, transformed a high-value real estate venture into a legal and environmental black hole. This section dissects the catastrophic financial consequences of this hubris, quantifying the price of failed due diligence and the staggering, non-negotiable costs of federal regulatory compliance. Quantifying the cost of regulatory stoppage. The moment the federal easement was confirmed, the partially completed golf course project, Sterling Heights, entered a state of emergency halt. In the world of high-stakes development, time is money, and a stoppage carries crippling financial penalties far exceeding the initial land cost. The immediate financial bleeding. When a multimillion-dollar construction project is suddenly frozen by a legal injunction or regulatory failure, the developer faces a mountain of non-recoverable costs that continue to accrue daily. Idle machinery and labor contracts, construction equipment, excavators, bulldozers, graders, is typically leased or financed. Sterling was obligated to pay for equipment and contracted labor, union or otherwise, even while the site stood motionless. Idle machinery costs hundreds of thousands of dollars per month in demurrage and rental fees. Interest on construction loans. Developers operate on large, short-term, high-interest construction loans. The project's delay meant that Sterling was paying massive daily interest on the borrowed capital for land acquisition and Phase 1 construction, with zero revenue generation. The clock kept ticking, compounding the debt without an end date in sight. Contract penalties and surety bonds, subcontractors for specialized work, irrigation systems, landscape architects, clubhouse construction, often embed stiff penalty clauses for developer-caused delays. Furthermore, the developer likely forfeited portions of the surety bonds, guarantees provided by third parties to ensure project completion, further complicating future financing. The legal hold on the project immediately shifted the adjacent land from an asset generating projected profits into a financial liability demanding constant, significant capital outflow. Image, a tense, cinematic shot of Mr. Sterling, the developer, in a lavish, modern office, standing over a blueprint. He is visibly frustrated, perhaps gesturing angrily at a junior lawyer or executive, who looks anxious. The blueprint has a red X or stop stamp over the section related to the protagonist's farmland, symbolizing the complete financial halt. The high price of environmental remediation. The core irony of the developer's downfall stems from the fact that his initial preparation violated the watershed protections designed to safeguard the neighboring federally protected farm. Once the NRCS, or an environmental watchdog agency acting on the USDA's behalf, got involved, the developer faced an expensive and specialized list of mandated remediation tasks. This was not a quick fix. This was a complete, retroactive environmental engineering overhaul. Best management practices, BMPs, and compliance costs. To satisfy the federal mandate and resume construction, Sterling Acquisitions was required to implement rigorous best management practices, BMPs, to control erosion and stormwater runoff, costs that were never budgeted for in their aggressive initial plan. These costs include engineering and design, hiring specialized civil and environmental engineers to redesign the entire site's drainage infrastructure to meet federal standards for the adjacent watershed. This design work alone is complex and time-consuming. Runoff pond construction. The most significant physical expense is the construction of federally mandated retention and detention ponds. These are large, engineered basins designed to hold and slowly filter stormwater runoff, allowing sediment to settle before the water re-enters the watershed. Digging, lining, and maintaining these ponds on a large scale adds millions to the project cost. Sediment and erosion control, installing temporary and permanent physical barriers, such as silt fences, straw wattles, and specialized erosion control blankets, across miles of disturbed ground to prevent topsoil migration onto the protected farmland. Hydroseeding and revegetation. Since the developer cleared vast areas, he was now required to rapidly stabilize the exposed ground by applying hydroseed and specialized native grasses to prevent further erosion, requiring expensive materials and specialized application equipment. These costs are exponentially higher than if the measures had been incorporated into the initial planning phase. Retrofitting a site to meet environmental compliance requirements often costs 30 to 50% more than building it correctly from the start, translating into tens of millions of dollars in unbudgeted expenses for a project of this scale. Erosion of confidence, investor and market impact. Beyond the measurable construction and compliance costs, the developer suffered immense collateral damage in two critical, yet intangible, areas: investor confidence and market viability. Investor scrutiny. Financial institutions and private equity investors who fund such massive projects operate on risk assessment. The failure to detect a fundamental, perpetual federal land restriction, the 1933 easement, constitutes a monumental failure of legal due diligence. This failure severely damages Sterling's reputation as a reliable development partner. Investors interpret this error not as a minor oversight, but as an indicator of systemic risk and incompetence, leading to tighter loan covenants. Any future project financing would be subject to much higher scrutiny, collateral requirements, and significantly less favorable interest rates. Shareholder-partner dissatisfaction. If Sterling Acquisitions is publicly traded or has external partners, the resulting delays, penalties, and unexpected costs lead directly to lawsuits and demands for management restructuring. Public relations disaster. Being exposed in court as a corporate entity that willingly threatened a family farm and violated environmental protections is a major public relations nightmare. In today's environmentally conscious market, this reputation tarnish affects the desirability of the luxury homes the developer plans to build, devaluing the entire project. The narrative reveals that the developer's attempts to recover by passing off the new compliance costs to the project's bottom line were complicated by the damaged brand and the now visible uncertainty surrounding the development's completion timeline. Project devaluation and opportunity cost. The enforced delay means that Sterling missed critical market windows for selling luxury golf memberships and pre-selling residential lots. Real estate markets are cyclical, and a years-long halt due to regulatory non-compliance means the developer may have to sell his completed properties in a depressed market or, worse, face a total project cancellation. The opportunity cost, the lost profits from other, less contentious projects that Sterling could have pursued, also became an overwhelming financial burden, entirely attributable to the hubristic decision to bypass basic historical research and challenge a federally protected conservation purpose. The economic resilience of the protected farm. In stark contrast to the developer's financial ruin, the protagonist, Marcus, finds his farm's economic stability unexpectedly solidified. The legal showdown provided a clear, public, and judicial confirmation of his farm's most valuable asset, its perpetual protection. The victory did several things for the farm's financial health. Zero acquisition risk. The farm is now untouchable by private developers. This eliminates the uncertainty and stress of future eminent domain threats, allowing the family to plan for generational transfers with confidence. Increased value as protected land. While the land is restricted from development, its value as premium, conserved, and ecologically sound farmland increases. Conservation buyers, land trusts, and organizations interested in sustainable agriculture view the federal easement as a beneficial guarantee, often providing financial incentives or tax advantages. Access to federal resources. By actively defending the easement and engaging with the NRCS over the developer's violations, the farmer strengthens his relationship with the USDA. This opens the door to continued eligibility for cost-sharing programs, technical assistance, and grants designed to further enhance soil health and water quality, subsidies that ensure the farm remains profitable and sustainable. The financial disaster for the developer was the financial validation for the farmer. The price of the developer's hubris paid for the farmer's peace of mind, proving that in certain circumstances, perpetual stewardship is a more stable long-term investment than speculative development. Beyond the farm, systemic implications for land use policy and agricultural conservation. The dramatic confrontation between a single farmer and a powerful developer, settled by an 8-year-old USDA document, transcends the boundaries of a single property dispute. It serves as a potent case study with far-reaching systemic implications for American land use policy, environmental regulation, and the ongoing relevance of agricultural conservation easements. This section explores how such a localized victory sends ripples through the legal, policy, and public consciousness spheres, affecting how states, counties, developers, and landowners approach the delicate balance between progress and preservation. Reaffirming federal supremacy and the power of historic easements. The most immediate and profound systemic implication of the protagonist's victory is the resounding reaffirmation of federal supremacy in land use matters when pre-existing federal mandates are in place. This case vividly illustrates that federal overrides local zoning ordinances, county eminent domain powers, and even state-level development plans can be superseded by older, but still active, federal conservation easements. This serves as a stark reminder for all levels of government and private entities that thorough due diligence must extend beyond current local codes to include historical federal land designations. Perpetuity means forever. The concept of in perpetuity in conservation easements is not merely legal jargon but a binding, enduring commitment. This case highlights that these easements do not simply fade with time or changing economic conditions. They remain an active legal force, capable of derailing modern development, decades or even centuries after their inception. Increased scrutiny of due diligence. The financial disaster faced by Sterling acquisitions will undoubtedly lead to increased scrutiny within the development industry regarding legal and historical property research. Corporate legal teams and title insurance companies will now have a clear, high-profile example of the catastrophic consequences of neglecting deep-dive historical analysis, especially concerning agricultural land. This could prompt new best practices for title searches that specifically target federal conservation filings. The outcome strengthens the legal standing of all existing federal conservation easements, effectively putting developers and local governments on notice that these instruments are not merely suggestions but formidable legal barriers against incompatible development. A synthesis of victory, the enduring lesson of stewardship and perpetual value. The tale of Marcus and his 120-acre farm, secured by a 1933 USDA conservation easement, is not merely a chronicle of legal success or corporate failure. It is a powerful, modern parable illustrating the perpetual value of stewardship over the transient promises of speculation. This final section synthesizes the critical themes, history, ecology, finance, and culture, to articulate the enduring lesson this case offers for landowners, developers, and policymakers in the 21st century. The ultimate victory, the past safeguarding the future. The core mechanism of victory was the sheer longevity and binding nature of the federal conservation commitment. The 1933 easement, born out of the national desperation of the Dust Bowl, provided a legal framework that possessed a fundamental strength modern zoning laws often lack. It was an agreement made in perpetuity for the sake of national, long-term resource security. Sterling acquisitions failed because their due diligence was focused only on the present and the local. They saw the land in terms of its highest market use, luxury development, ignoring its highest ecological and historical use, protected farmland. The case demonstrates a profound truth. Certain federally protected commitments, tied to existential national crises like soil and water health, are virtually impregnable against challenges based purely on economic gain. The past, in this instance, provided the most powerful defense imaginable for the future. Redefining highest and best use. The doctrine of highest and best use often dictates land valuation in real estate, typically favoring the most financially lucrative development, e.g., converting a farm into a golf course. Marcus's victory fundamentally challenges this doctrine in protected landscapes. The courts and regulatory agencies affirmed that for this land, the highest and best use was its conserved use. The perpetuity clause enforced this notion, making its value non-negotiable in the face of development pressure. This precedent is invaluable for the modern conservation movement. It validates the argument that the true economic value of farmland must incorporate its unquantified public benefits. Food security, ensuring the continued capacity for local food production. Ecological services, providing flood control, carbon sequestration, and clean water filtration. Cultural legacy, preserving the unique identity and community structure built around farming. The developer's financial ruin further reinforces the lesson. Ignoring these non-market values and attempting to force a higher, speculative use onto restricted land carries a financial penalty that can bankrupt the speculator. A call for cultural resilience and due diligence. Ultimately, the case is a testament to the resilience of the American farmer. Marcus was not saved by a sudden windfall or a political favor, but by the generational commitment of his family who, decades ago, chose national stewardship over short-term gain by signing that original 1933 document. His personal tenacity, fueled by the farm's cultural weight, Section 5, was the emotional engine that sustained the legal fight. For developers and governments, the message is clear. Due diligence must extend into deep historical records. Failing to uncover an obscure, federally recorded easement is no longer a footnote error. It is an act of gross negligence with catastrophic financial consequences. The story concludes not with a battle won, but with a legacy secured. Marcus and his family resume their essential work, having reaffirmed the principle that the ground beneath their feet is more than just dirt for sale. It is a trust held for future generations, perpetually protected by the weight of American history and law. Epilogue: the perpetual field and the cost of reckoning. The legal drama ended not with a triumphant shout, but with a quiet return to the rhythm of the seasons. The courtroom victory only closed the book on the conflict. The act of returning to the fields closed the chapter on fear. Section 7 provides a final glimpse into the aftermath, contrasting the newfound security of the farmer with the systemic fallout for the corporate entity, and offers a final reflection on the true meaning of perpetuity. Marcus's dawn, security and a renewed purpose. For Marcus, the victory meant more than just keeping the land. It meant reclaiming his peace of mind. The family legacy, once under threat, was now legally and eternally affirmed. The 1933 USDA Conservation Easement was no longer an obscure document. It was the foundation of his children's future. The practical effects were immediate. Financial stability, the farm, publicly validated as untouchable, gained access to specialized federal funding and grants reserved for land under permanent conservation. This influx of capital allowed Marcus to invest in modern, sustainable farming technology, ensuring the land remains viable and productive well into the 21st century. Community restoration. The case became a rallying point. The local community, which had been pressured by the developer's job promises, saw the true value of preserved agricultural land and local food production over speculative real estate. Marcus became a local figurehead for land stewardship, leading educational efforts on conservation easements for other farmers. Generational trust. Marcus established a clear, generational succession plan. The victory over eminent domain meant his children and grandchildren could pursue farming careers with the absolute assurance that no private corporation could seize their inheritance. The field, once a prize in a hostile takeover, became a perpetual symbol of resilience, a quiet testament to the idea that some things are too valuable to be priced. Sterling's sunset. The inevitable fall. Mr. Sterling and Sterling Acquisitions faced an irreversible decline. The combination of factors detailed in Section 3, massive carrying costs on idle land, exorbitant retrofitting fees for watershed remediation, and a catastrophic loss of investor confidence, proved fatal. Project abandonment. The Sterling Heights development was officially declared unviable. The adjacent land, contaminated by regulatory failure, was eventually sold at a steep discount to a regional land trust that agreed to manage the watershed remediation and convert the property into a mix of open space and lower density, environmentally compliant residential plots. Legal scrutiny. The failure prompted an investigation into Sterling's due diligence processes and led to shareholder lawsuits for gross negligence. Mr. Sterling was forced to resign, his career ending not in a spectacular deal, but in a bureaucratic tangle of environmental compliance reports. The downfall became a required case study in business schools and law firms, serving as a permanent warning. Federal environmental law, regardless of its age, must be respected as the ultimate authority in land use planning. The enduring lesson of perpetual value. The most profound legacy of the case is the understanding it imparts on the concept of perpetuity. In an age defined by quarterly earnings reports and rapid market fluctuations, the 1933 easement introduced a hard stop, a value defined not by the market, but by a moral and ecological commitment that transcends human lifespans. The case serves as a final, powerful reminder. The value of the field, defined by its utility in perpetuity, was infinitely greater than the value of the golf course, defined by its potential speculation. The farm stands, a living monument to the wisdom of the New Deal conservationists, proving that the most ancient of virtues, the responsible stewardship of the earth, is often the strongest legal defense against the relentless pressure of modern capital.